Europe is a continent located entirely in the Northern Hemisphere and mostly in the Eastern Hemisphere. It is bordered by the Arctic Ocean to the north, the Atlantic Ocean to the west, the Mediterranean Sea to the south, and Asia to the east. Europe shares the land mass of Eurasia with Asia, and of Afro-Eurasia with both Asia and Africa. Europe is commonly considered to be separated from Asia by the watershed of the Ural Mountains, the Ural River, the Caspian Sea, the Greater Caucasus, the Black Sea, and the waterway of the Bosporus Strait. Europe covers about 10.18 million square kilometers, or 2% of Earth's surface, making it the second smallest continent. Politically, Europe is divided into about 50 sovereign states, of which Russia is the largest and most populous, spanning 39% of the continent and comprising 15% of its population. Europe had a total population of about 745 million. In 2021, the third largest after Asia and Africa. The European climate is affected by warm Atlantic currents, such as the Gulf Stream, which produce a temperate climate, tempering winters and summers, on much of the continent. Further from the sea, seasonal differences are more noticeable, producing more continental climates. European culture consists of a range of national and regional cultures, which form the central roots of the wider Western civilization, and together commonly reference ancient Greece and ancient Rome, particularly through their Christian successors, as crucial and shared roots. Beginning with the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE, Christian consolidation of Europe in the wake of the migration period marked the European post-classical Middle Ages. The Renaissance, radiating from Florence, spread to the rest of the continent a new humanist interest in art and science. Since the Age of Discovery, led by Spain and Portugal, Europe played a predominant role in global affairs with multiple explorations and conquests around the world. Between the 16th and 20th centuries, European powers colonized at various times the Americas, almost all of Africa and Oceania, and the majority of Asia. The Age of Enlightenment, the French Revolution, and the Napoleonic Wars shaped the continent culturally, politically, and economically from the end of the 17th century until the first half of the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution, which began in Great Britain at the end of the 18th century, gave rise to radical economic, cultural, and social change in Western Europe and eventually the wider world. Both world wars began and were fought to a great extent in Europe, contributing to a decline in Western European dominance in world affairs by the mid-20th century as the Soviet Union and the United States took prominence and competed over dominance in Europe and globally. The resulting Cold War divided Europe along the Iron Curtain, with NATO in the west and the Warsaw Pact in the east. This divide ended with the revolutions of 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which allowed European integration to advance significantly. European integration is being advanced institutionally since 1948 with the founding of the Council of Europe, and significantly through the realization of the European Union, which represents today the majority of Europe. The European Union is a supranational political entity that lies between a confederation and a federation and is based on a system of European treaties. The EU originated in Western Europe but has been expanding eastward since the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. A majority of its members have adopted a common currency, the euro, and participate in the European single market and a customs union. A large bloc of countries, the Schengen area, have also abolished internal border and immigration controls. Regular popular elections take place every 5 years within the EU. They are considered to be the second largest democratic elections in the world after India's. The EU is the third largest economy in the world. Name. The place name Evros was first used by the ancient Greeks to refer to their northernmost province, which bears the same name today. The principal river there, Evros, today's Maritsa, flows through the fertile valleys of Thrace. In classical Greek mythology, Europa, ancient Greek, Epsilon Ropieta, Europe, was a Phoenician princess. One view is that her name derives from the ancient Greek elements wide, broad, and eye, face, countenance, hence their composite Europe would mean wide-gazing or broad of aspect. Broad has been an epithet of Earth herself in the reconstructed Proto-Indo-European religion and the poetry devoted to it. An alternative view is that of Robert Beeks, who has argued in favor of a pre-Indo-European origin for the name, explaining that a derivation from Eurus would yield a different toponym than Europa. Beeks has located toponyms related to that of Europa in the territory of ancient Greece, and localities such as that of Europo in ancient Macedonia. There have been attempts to connect Europe to a Semitic term for west, this being either Akkadian Arabu meaning to go down, set, or Phoenician Arab evening, west, which is at the origin of Arabic Maghreb and Hebrew Maghreb. Martin Litchfield West stated that phonologically, the match between Europa's name and any form of the Semitic word is very poor, while Beeks considers a connection to Semitic languages improbable. Most major world languages use words derived from Europe or Europa to refer to the continent. Chinese, for example, uses the word Ozhu, which is an abbreviation of the transliterated name Ulubajo. A similar Chinese-derived term Oshu is also sometimes used in Japanese, such as in the Japanese name of the European Union, Oshurengo, despite the katakana Europa being more commonly used. In some Turkic languages, the originally Persian name Frangistan means land of the Franks is used casually in referring to much of Europe, besides official names such as Avropa or Evropa. The prevalent definition of Europe as a geographical term has been in use since the mid-19th century. Europe is taken to be bounded by large bodies of water to the north, west and south. Europe's limits to the east and northeast are usually taken to be the Ural Mountains, the Ural River, and the Caspian Sea. To the southeast, the Caucasus Mountains, the Black Sea, and the waterways connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean Sea. Islands are generally grouped with the nearest continental landmass, hence Iceland is considered to be part of Europe, while the nearby island of Greenland is usually assigned to North America, although politically belonging to Denmark. Nevertheless, there are some exceptions based on socio-political and cultural differences. Cyprus is closest to Anatolia, but is considered part of Europe politically, and it is a member state of the EU. Malta was considered an island of northwestern Africa for centuries, but now it is considered to be part of Europe as well. Europe, as used specifically in British English, may also refer to continental Europe exclusively. The term continent usually implies the physical geography of a large land mass completely or almost completely surrounded by water at its borders. Prior to the adoption of the current convention that includes mountain divides, the border between Europe and Asia had been redefined several times since its first conception in classical antiquity, but always as a series of rivers, seas, and straits that were believed to extend an unknown distance east and north from the Mediterranean Sea without the inclusion of any mountain ranges. Cartographer Hermann Moll suggested in 1715 Europe was bounded by a series of partly joined waterways directed towards the Turkish Straits, and the Irtish River draining into the upper part of the Obi River and the Arctic Ocean. In contrast, the present eastern boundary of Europe partially adheres to the Ural and Caucasus Mountains, which is somewhat arbitrary and inconsistent compared to any clear-cut definition of the term continent. The current division of Eurasia into two continents now reflects east-west cultural, linguistic, and ethnic differences which vary on a spectrum rather than with a sharp dividing line. The geographic border between Europe and Asia does not follow any state boundaries and now only follows a few bodies of water. Turkey is generally considered a transcontinental country divided entirely by water, while Russia and Kazakhstan are only partly divided by waterways. France, the Netherlands, Portugal, and Spain are also transcontinental, or more properly, intercontinental, when oceans or large seas are involved, in that their main land areas are in Europe while pockets of their territories are located on other continents separated from Europe by large bodies of water. Spain, for example, has territories south of the Mediterranean Sea, namely, Ceuta and Melilla, which are parts of Africa and share a border with Morocco. According to the current convention, Georgia and Azerbaijan are transcontinental countries where waterways have been completely replaced by mountains as the divide between continents. Definition: the first recorded usage of Europe as a geographic term is in the Homeric hymn to Dela in Apollo, in reference to the western shore of the Aegean Sea. As a name for a part of the known world, it is first used in the 6th century BCE by Anaximander and Hecataeus. Anaximander placed the boundary between Asia and Europe along the Phasis River in the Caucasus, a convention still followed by Herodotus in the 5th century BCE. Herodotus mentioned that the world had been divided by unknown persons into three parts: Europe, Asia, and Libya, with the Nile and the Phasis forming their boundaries, though he also states that some considered the river Don, rather than the Phasis, as the boundary between Europe and Asia. Europe's eastern frontier was defined in the 1st century by geographer Strabo at the river Don. The Book of Jubilees described the continents as the lands given by Noah to his 3 sons. Europe was defined as stretching from the Pillars of Hercules at the Strait of Gibraltar, separating it from northwest Africa, to the Don, separating it from Asia. The convention received by the Middle Ages and surviving into modern usage is that of the Roman era, used by Roman era authors such as Posidonius, Strabo, and Ptolemy, who took the Tanis as the boundary. The Roman Empire did not attach a strong identity to the concept of continental divisions. However, following the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the culture that developed in its place, linked to Latin and the Catholic Church, began to associate itself with the concept of Europe. The term Europe is first used for a cultural sphere in the Carolingian Renaissance of the 9th century. From that time, the term designated the sphere of influence of the Western Church, as opposed to both the Eastern Orthodox churches and to the Islamic world. A cultural definition of Europe as the lands of Latin Christendom coalesced in the 8th century, signifying the new cultural condominium created through the confluence of Germanic traditions and Christian Latin culture, defined partly in contrast with Byzantium and Islam, and limited to northern Iberia, the British Isles, France, Christianized Western Germany, the Alpine regions, and northern and central Italy. The concept is one of the lasting legacies of the Carolingian Renaissance. Europa often figures in the letters of Charlemagne's court scholar, Alcuin. The transition of Europe to being a cultural term as well as a geographic one led to the borders of Europe being affected by cultural considerations in the East, especially relating to areas under Byzantine, Ottoman, and Russian influence. Such questions were affected by the positive connotations associated with the term Europe by its users. Such cultural considerations were not applied to the Americas, despite their conquest and settlement by European states. Instead, the concept of Western civilization emerged as a way of grouping together Europe and these colonies. The question of defining a precise eastern boundary of Europe arises in the early modern period, as the eastern extension of Muscovy began to include North Asia. Throughout the Middle Ages and into the 18th century, the traditional division of the land mass of Eurasia into 2 continents, Europe and Asia, followed Ptolemy, with the boundary following the Turkish Straits, the Black Sea, the Kerch Strait, the Sea of Azov and the Don. But maps produced during the 16th to 18th centuries tended to differ in how to continue the boundary beyond the Don Bend at Kalachene-Donu, into territory not described in any detail by the ancient geographers. Around 1715, Hermann Moll produced a map showing the northern part of the Obi River and the Irtysh River, a major tributary of the Obi, as components of a series of partly joined waterways taking the boundary between Europe and Asia from the Turkish Straits, and the Don River all the way to the Arctic Ocean. In 1721, he produced a more up-to-date map that was easier to read. However, his proposal to adhere to major rivers as the line of demarcation was never taken up by other geographers who were beginning to move away from the idea of water boundaries as the only legitimate divides between Europe and Asia. 4 years later, in 1725, Philip Johann von Strahlenberg was the first to depart from the classical Don boundary. He drew a new line along the Volga, following the Volga north until the Samara Bend, along Obshchai Syrt, then north and east along the latter waterway to its source in the Ural Mountains. At this point he proposed that mountain ranges could be included as boundaries between continents as alternatives to nearby waterways. Accordingly, he drew 2W the new boundary north along Ural Mountains rather than the nearby and parallel running Obi and Irtysh rivers. This was endorsed by the Russian Empire and introduced the convention that would eventually become commonly accepted. However, this did not come without criticism. Voltaire, writing in 1760 about Peter the Great's efforts to make Russia more European, ignored the whole boundary question with his claim that neither Russia, Scandinavia, northern Germany, nor Poland were fully part of Europe. Since then, many modern analytical geographers like Halford Mackinder have declared that they see little validity in the Ural Mountains as a boundary between continents. The mapmakers continued to differ on the boundary between the Lower Don and Samara well into the 19th century. The 1745 atlas published by the Russian Academy of Sciences has the boundary follow the Don beyond Kalach as far as Serafimovik before cutting north towards Arkhangelsk, while other 18th to 19th century mapmakers such as John Carey followed Strahlenberg's prescription. To the south, the Kuma, Menek Depression was identified c. 1773 by a German naturalist, Peter Simon Pallas, as a valley that once connected the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, and subsequently was proposed as a natural boundary between continents. By the mid-19th century, there were 3 main conventions, one following the Don, the Volga, Don Canal and the Volga, the other following the Kuma, Menek Depression to the Caspian and then the Ural River, and the third abandoning the Don altogether, following the Greater Caucasus watershed to the Caspian. The question was still treated as a controversy in geographical literature of the 1860s, with Douglas Freshfield advocating the Caucasus crest boundary as the best possible, citing support from various modern geographers. In Russia and the Soviet Union, the boundary along the Kuma, Menek Depression was the most commonly used as early as 1906. In 1958, the Soviet Geographical Society formally recommended that the boundary between the Europe and Asia be drawn in textbooks from Vydorovskaya Bay, on the Kara Sea, along the eastern foot of Ural Mountains, then following the Ural River until the Mujajar Hills, and then the Emba River, and Kuma, Menek Depression, thus placing the Caucasus entirely in Asia and the Urals entirely in Europe. The Flora Europaea adopted a boundary along the Terek and Kuban rivers, so southwards from the Kuma and the Menek, but still with the Caucasus entirely in Asia. However, most geographers in the Soviet Union favored the boundary along the Caucasus crest, and this became the common convention in the later 20th century, although the Kuma, Menek boundary remained in use in some 20th century maps. Some view the separation of Eurasia into Asia and Europe as a residue of Eurocentrism. In physical, cultural, and historical diversity, China and India are comparable to the entire European landmass, not to a single European country. History. During the 2.5 million years of the Pleistocene, numerous cold phases called glacials means ice age, or significant advances of continental ice sheets in Europe and North America, occurred at intervals of approximately 40,000 to 100,000 years. The long glacial periods were separated by more temperate and shorter interglacials which lasted about 10,000 to 15,000 years. The last cold episode of the last glacial period ended about 10,000 years ago. Earth is currently in an interglacial period of the Quaternary, called the Holocene. Homo erectus georgicus, which lived roughly 1.8 million years ago in Georgia, is the earliest hominin to have been discovered in Europe. Other hominin remains, dating back roughly 1 million years, have been discovered in Atapuerca, Spain. Neanderthal man appeared in Europe 150,000 years ago and disappeared from the fossil record about 40,000 years ago, with their final refuge being the Iberian Peninsula. The Neanderthals were supplanted by modern humans, who appeared in Europe around 43,000 to 40,000 years ago. Homo sapiens arrived in Europe around 54,000 years ago, some 10,000 years earlier than previously thought. The earliest sites in Europe dated 48,000 years ago are Ribero Machi or Italy, Geisenklosterl, or Germany, and Isteritz or France. The European Neolithic period marked by the cultivation of crops and the raising of livestock, increased numbers of settlements and the widespread use of pottery began around 7000 BCE in Greece and the Balkans, probably influenced by earlier farming practices in Anatolia and the Near East. It spread from the Balkans along the valleys of the Danube and the Rhine, and along the Mediterranean coast. Between 4500 and 3000 BCE, these Central European Neolithic cultures developed further to the west and the north, transmitting newly acquired skills in producing copper artifacts. In Western Europe, the Neolithic period was characterized not by large agricultural settlements but by field monuments, such as causewayed enclosures, burial mounds, and megalithic tombs. The Cordware cultural horizon flourished at the transition from the Neolithic to the Chalcolithic. During this period, giant megalithic monuments, such as the megalithic temples of Malta and Stonehenge, were constructed throughout Western and Southern Europe. The modern native populations of Europe largely descend from three distinct lineages: Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, descended from populations associated with the Paleolithic Epigravitian culture, Neolithic early European farmers who migrated from Anatolia during the Neolithic Revolution 9,000 years ago, and Yamnaya steppe herders who expanded into Europe from the Pontic, Caspian steppe of Ukraine and southern Russia in the context of Indo-European migrations 5,000 years ago. The European Bronze Age began c. 3200 BCE in Greece with the Minoan civilization on Crete, the first advanced civilization in Europe. The Minoans were followed by the Mycenaeans, who collapsed suddenly around 1200 BCE, ushering the European Iron Age. Iron Age colonization by the Greeks and Phoenicians gave rise to early Mediterranean cities. Early Iron Age Italy and Greece from around the 8th century BCE gradually gave rise to historical classical antiquity, whose beginning is sometimes dated to 776 BCE, the year of the first Olympic Games. Ancient Greece was the founding culture of Western civilization. Western democratic and rationalist culture are often attributed to ancient Greece. The Greek city-state, the polis, was the fundamental political unit of classical Greece. In 508 BCE, Cleisthenes instituted the world's first democratic system of government in Athens. The Greek political ideals were rediscovered in the late 18th century by European philosophers and idealists. Greece also generated many cultural contributions, in philosophy, humanism, and rationalism under Aristotle, Socrates and Plato, in history with Herodotus and Thucydides, in dramatic and narrative verse, starting with the epic poems of Homer, in drama with Sophocles and Euripides, in medicine with Hippocrates and Galen, and in science with Pythagoras, Euclid, and Archimedes. In the course of the 5th century BCE, several of the Greek city-states would ultimately check the Achaemenid Persian advance in Europe through the Greco-Persian Wars, considered a pivotal moment in world history, as the 50 years of peace that followed are known as Golden Age of Athens, the seminal period of ancient Greece that laid many of the foundations of Western civilization. Greece was followed by Rome, which left its mark on law, politics, language, engineering, architecture, government, and many more key aspects in Western civilization. By 200 BCE, Rome had conquered Italy, and over the following 2 centuries it conquered Greece and Hispania, including Spain and Portugal, the North African coast, much of the Middle East, Gaul including France and Belgium, and Britannia including England and Wales. Expanding from their base in central Italy beginning in the 3rd century BCE, the Romans gradually expanded to eventually rule the entire Mediterranean basin and Western Europe by the turn of the millennium. The Roman Republic ended in 27 BCE, when Augustus proclaimed the Roman Empire. The 2 centuries that followed are known as the Pax Romana, a period of unprecedented peace, prosperity, and political stability in most of Europe. The empire continued to expand under emperors such as Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius, who spent time on the empire's northern border fighting Germanic, Pictish, and Scottish tribes. Christianity was legalized by Constantine I in 313 CE after 3 centuries of imperial persecution. Constantine also permanently moved the capital of the empire from Rome to the city of Byzantium, modern-day Istanbul, which was renamed Constantinople in his honor in 330 CE. Christianity became the sole official religion of the empire in 380 CE, and in 391 to 392 CE, the Emperor Theodosius outlawed pagan religions. This is sometimes considered to mark the end of antiquity. Alternatively, antiquity is considered to end with the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE, the closure of the pagan Platonic Academy of Athens in 529 CE, or the rise of Islam in the early 7th century CE. During most of its existence, the Byzantine Empire was one of the most powerful economic, cultural, and military forces in Europe. During the decline of the Roman Empire, Europe entered a long period of change arising from what historians call the Age of Migrations. There were numerous invasions and migrations amongst the Ostrogoths, Visigoths, Goths, Vandals, Huns, Franks, Angles, Saxons, Slavs, Avars, Bulgars, and, later on, the Vikings, Pechenegs, Cumans and Magyars. Renaissance thinkers such as Petrarch would later refer to this as the Dark Ages. Isolated monastic communities were the only places to safeguard and compile written knowledge accumulated previously. Apart from this, very few written records survive, and much literature, philosophy, mathematics, and other thinking from the classical period disappeared from Western Europe, though they were preserved in the East, in the Byzantine Empire. While the Roman Empire in the West continued to decline, Roman traditions and the Roman state remained strong in the predominantly Greek-speaking Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire. During most of its existence, the Byzantine Empire was the most powerful economic, cultural, and military force in Europe. Emperor Justinian I presided over Constantinople's first Golden Age. He established a legal code that forms the basis of many modern legal systems, funded the construction of the Hagia Sophia, and brought the Christian Church under state control. From the 7th century onwards, as the Byzantines and neighboring Sassanid Persians were severely weakened due to the protracted, centuries-lasting and frequent Byzantine, Sasanian wars, the Muslim Arabs began to make inroads into historically Roman territory, taking the Levant and North Africa and making inroads into Asia Minor. In the mid-7th century, following the Muslim conquest of Persia, Islam penetrated into the Caucasus region. Over the next centuries, Muslim forces took Cyprus, Malta, Crete, Sicily, and parts of southern Italy. Between 711 and 720, most of the lands of the Visigothic Kingdom of Iberia was brought under Muslim rule save for small areas in the northwest and largely Basque regions in the Pyrenees. This territory, under the Arabic name Al-Andalus, became part of the expanding Umayyad Caliphate. The unsuccessful second siege of Constantinople 717 weakened the Umayyad dynasty and reduced their prestige. The Umayyads were then defeated by the Frankish leader Charles Martel at the Battle of Poitiers in 732, which ended their northward advance. In the remote regions of northwestern Iberia and the Middle Pyrenees, the power of the Muslims in the south was scarcely felt. It was here that the foundations of the Christian kingdoms of Asturias, Leon, and Galicia were laid, and from where the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula would start. However, no coordinated attempt would be made to drive the Moors out. The Christian kingdoms were mainly focused on their own internal power struggles. As a result, the Reconquista took the greater part of 800 years, in which period a long list of Alfonsos, Sanchos, Ordenos, Ramiros, Fernandos, and Bermudos would be fighting their Christian rivals as much as the Muslim invaders. During the Dark Ages, the Western Roman Empire fell under the control of various tribes. The Germanic and Slav tribes established their domains over Western and Eastern Europe, respectively. Eventually the Frankish tribes were united under Clovis I Charlemagne, a Frankish king of the Carolingian dynasty who had conquered most of Western Europe, was anointed Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope in 800. This led in 962 to the founding of the Holy Roman Empire, which eventually became centered in the German principalities of Central Europe. East Central Europe saw the creation of the first Slavic states and the adoption of Christianity. The powerful West Slavic state of Great Moravia spread its territory all the way south to the Balkans, reaching its largest territorial extent under Svetopluk I and causing a series of armed conflicts with East Francia. Further south, the first South Slavic states emerged in the late 7th and 8th century and adopted Christianity, the First Bulgarian Empire, the Serbian Principality and the Duchy of Croatia. To the east, Kievan Rus expanded from its capital in Kiev to become the largest state in Europe by the 10th century. In 988, Vladimir the Great adopted Orthodox Christianity as the religion of state. Further east, Volga Bulgaria became an Islamic state in the 10th century, but was eventually absorbed into Russia several centuries later. The period between the year 1000 and 1250 is known as the High Middle Ages, followed by the Late Middle Ages until c. 1500. During the High Middle Ages the population of Europe experienced significant growth, culminating in the Renaissance of the 12th century. Economic growth, together with the lack of safety on the mainland trading routes, made possible the development of major commercial routes along the coast of the Mediterranean and Baltic Seas. The growing wealth and independence acquired by some coastal cities gave the maritime republics a leading role in the European scene. The Middle Ages on the mainland were dominated by the two upper echelons of the social structure, the nobility and the clergy. Feudalism developed in France in the early Middle Ages, and soon spread throughout Europe. A struggle for influence between the nobility and the monarchy in England led to the writing of the Magna Carta and the establishment of a parliament. The primary source of culture in this period came from the Roman Catholic Church. Through monasteries and cathedral schools, the Church was responsible for education in much of Europe. The papacy reached the height of its power during the High Middle Ages. An East-West schism in 1054 split the former Roman Empire religiously, with the Eastern Orthodox Church in the Byzantine Empire and the Roman Catholic Church in the former Western Roman Empire. In 1095 Pope Urban II called for a crusade against Muslims occupying Jerusalem and the Holy Land. In Europe itself, the Church organized the Inquisition against heretics. In the Iberian Peninsula, The Reconquista concluded with the fall of Granada in 1492, ending over 7 centuries of Islamic rule in the southwestern peninsula. In the east, a resurgent Byzantine Empire recaptured Crete and Cyprus from the Muslims, and reconquered the Balkans. Constantinople was the largest and wealthiest city in Europe from the 9th to the 12th centuries, with a population of approximately 400,000. The empire was weakened following the defeat at Manzikert, and was weakened considerably by the sack of Constantinople in 1204, during the Fourth Crusade. Although it would recover Constantinople in 1261, Byzantium fell in 1453 when Constantinople was taken by the Ottoman Empire. In the 11th and 12th centuries, constant incursions by nomadic Turkic tribes, such as the Pechenegs and the Cuman Kipchuks, caused a massive migration of Slavic populations to the safer, heavily forested regions of the north, and temporarily halted the expansion of the Rus state to the south and east. Like many other parts of Eurasia, these territories were overrun by the Mongols. The invaders, who became known as Tatars, were mostly Turkic-speaking peoples under Mongol suzerainty. They established the state of the Golden Horde with headquarters in Crimea, which later adopted Islam as a religion, and ruled over modern-day southern and central Russia for more than 3 centuries. After the collapse of Mongol dominions, the first Romanian states emerged in the 14th century, Moldavia and Wallachia. Previously, these territories were under the successive control of Pechenegs and Cumans. From the 12th to the 15th centuries, the Grand Duchy of Moscow grew from a small principality under Mongol rule to the largest state in Europe, overthrowing the Mongols in 1480, and eventually becoming the Tsardom of Russia. The state was consolidated under Ivan III the Great and Ivan the Terrible, steadily expanding to the east and south over the next centuries. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 was the first crisis that would strike Europe in the late Middle Ages. The period between 1348 and 1420 witnessed the heaviest loss. The population of France was reduced by half. Medieval Britain was afflicted by 95 famines, and France suffered the effects of 75 or more in the same period. Europe was devastated in the mid-14th century by the Black Death, one of the most deadly pandemics in human history, which killed an estimated 25 million people in Europe alone, a third of the European population at the time. The plague had a devastating effect on Europe's social structure. It induced people to live for the moment, as illustrated by Giovanni Boccaccio in the Decameron. It was a serious blow to the Roman Catholic Church and led to increased persecution of Jews, beggars, and lepers. The plague is thought to have returned every generation with varying virulence and mortalities until the 18th century. During this period, more than 100 plague epidemics swept across Europe. The Renaissance was a period of cultural change originating in Florence, and later spreading to the rest of Europe. The rise of a new humanism was accompanied by the recovery of forgotten classical Greek and Arabic knowledge from monastic libraries, often translated from Arabic into Latin. The Renaissance spread across Europe between the 14th and 16th centuries. It saw the flowering of art, philosophy, music, and the sciences, under the joint patronage of royalty, the nobility, the Roman Catholic Church, and an emerging merchant class. Patrons in Italy, including the Medici family of Florentine bankers and the popes in Rome, funded prolific Quattrocento and Cinquecento artists such as Raphael, Michelangelo, and Leonardo da Vinci. Political intrigue within the church in the mid-14th century caused the Western Schism. During this 40-year period, 2 popes, one in Avignon and one in Rome, claimed rulership over the church. Although the schism was eventually healed in 1417, the papacy's spiritual authority had suffered greatly. In the 15th century, Europe started to extend itself beyond its geographic frontiers. Spain and Portugal, the greatest naval powers of the time, took the lead in exploring the world. Exploration reached the Southern Hemisphere in the Atlantic and the southern tip of Africa. Christopher Columbus reached the New World in 1492, and Vasco da Gama opened the ocean route to the east linking the Atlantic and Indian Oceans in 1498. The Portuguese-born explorer Ferdinand Magellan reached Asia westward across the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans in a Spanish expedition, resulting in the first circumnavigation of the globe, completed by the Spaniard Juan Sebastián Elcano. Soon after, the Spanish and Portuguese began establishing large global empires in the Americas, Asia, Africa, and Oceania. France, the Netherlands, and England soon followed in building large colonial empires with vast holdings in Africa, the Americas and Asia. In 1588, a Spanish armada failed to invade England. A year later England tried unsuccessfully to invade Spain, allowing Philip II of Spain to maintain his dominant war capacity in Europe. This English disaster also allowed the Spanish fleet to retain its capability to wage war for the next decades. However, two more Spanish armadas failed to invade England. The Church's power was further weakened by the Protestant Reformation in 1517 when German theologian Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses criticizing the selling of indulgences to the church door. He was subsequently excommunicated in the papal bull Ex Surge Domini in 1520 and his followers were condemned in the 1521 Diet of Worms, which divided German princes between Protestant and Roman Catholic faiths. Religious fighting and warfare spread with Protestantism. The plunder of the empires of the Americas allowed Spain to finance religious persecution in Europe for over a century. The 30 Years' War crippled the Holy Roman Empire and devastated much of Germany, killing between 25 and 40% of its population. In the aftermath of the Peace of Westphalia, France rose to predominance within Europe. The defeat of the Ottoman Turks at the Battle of Vienna in 1683 marked the historic end of Ottoman expansion into Europe. The 17th century in Central and parts of Eastern Europe was a period of general decline. The region experienced more than 150 famines in a 200-year period between 1501 and 1700. From the Union of Krakow, East Central Europe was dominated by the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. The hegemony of the vast Polish, Lithuanian Commonwealth had ended with the devastation brought by the Second Northern War and subsequent conflicts. The state itself was partitioned and ceased to exist at the end of the 18th century. From the 15th to 18th centuries, when the disintegrating Khanates of the Golden Horde were conquered by Russia, Tatars from the Crimean Khanate frequently raided eastern Slavic lands to capture slaves. Further east, the Nogai Horde and Kazakh Khanate frequently raided the Slavic-speaking areas of contemporary Russia and Ukraine for hundreds of years, until the Russian expansion and conquest of most of northern Eurasia. The Renaissance and the new monarchs marked the start of an age of discovery, a period of exploration, invention, and scientific development. Among the great figures of the Western scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries were Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, and Isaac Newton. According to Peter Barrett, it is widely accepted that modern science arose in the Europe of the 17th century, introducing a new understanding of the natural world. The 7 Years' War brought to an end the old system of alliances in Europe. Consequently, when the American Revolutionary War turned into a global war between 1778 and 1783, Britain found itself opposed by a strong coalition of European powers, and lacking any substantial ally. The Age of Enlightenment was a powerful intellectual movement during the 18th century promoting scientific and reason-based thoughts. Discontent with the aristocracy and clergy's monopoly on political power in France resulted in the French Revolution, and the establishment of the First Republic, as a result of which the monarchy and many of the nobility perished during the initial Reign of Terror. Napoleon Bonaparte rose to power in the aftermath of the French Revolution, and established the First French Empire that, during the Napoleonic Wars, grew to encompass large parts of Europe before collapsing in 1815 with the Battle of Waterloo. Napoleonic rule resulted in the further dissemination of the ideals of the French Revolution, including that of the nation-state, as well as the widespread adoption of the French models of administration, law, and education. The Congress of Vienna, convened after Napoleon's downfall, established a new balance of power in Europe centered on the five great powers, the UK, France, Prussia, Austria, and Russia. This balance would remain in place until the revolutions of 1848, during which liberal uprisings affected all of Europe except for Russia and the UK. These revolutions were eventually put down by conservative elements and few reforms resulted. The year 1859 saw the unification of Romania, as a nation-state, from smaller principalities. In 1867, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was formed. 1871 saw the unifications of both Italy and Germany as nation-states from smaller principalities. In parallel, the Eastern question grew more complex ever since the Ottoman defeat in the Russo-Turkish War. As the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire seemed imminent, the great powers struggled to safeguard their strategic and commercial interests in the Ottoman domains. The Russian Empire stood to benefit from the decline, whereas the Habsburg Empire and Britain perceived the preservation of the Ottoman Empire to be in their best interests. Meanwhile, the Serbian Revolution and Greek War of Independence marked the beginning of the end of Ottoman rule in the Balkans, which ended with the Balkan Wars in 1912. Formal recognition of the de facto independent principalities of Montenegro, Serbia, and Romania ensued at the Congress of Berlin in 1878. The Industrial Revolution started in Great Britain in the last part of the 18th century and spread throughout Europe. The invention and implementation of new technologies resulted in rapid urban growth, mass employment, and the rise of a new working class. Reforms in social and economic spheres followed, including the first laws on child labor, the legalization of trade unions, and the abolition of slavery. In Britain, the Public Health Act of 1875 was passed, which significantly improved living conditions in many British cities. Europe's population increased from about 100 million in 1700 to 400 million by 1900. The last major famine recorded in Western Europe, the Great Famine of Ireland, caused death and mass emigration of millions of Irish people. In the 19th century, 70 million people left Europe in migrations to various European colonies abroad and to the United States. The Industrial Revolution also led to large population growth, and the share of the world population living in Europe reached a peak of slightly above 25% around the year 1913. Two world wars and an economic depression dominated the first half of the 20th century. The First World War was fought between 1914 and 1918. It started when Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated by the Yugoslav nationalist Gavrilo Princip. Most European nations were drawn into the war, which was fought between the Entente powers France, Belgium, Serbia, Portugal, Russia, the United Kingdom, and later Italy, Greece, Romania, and the United States, and the Central Powers Austria-Hungary, Germany, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. The war left more than 16 million civilians and military dead. Over 60 million European soldiers were mobilized from 1914 to 1918. Russia was plunged into the Russian Revolution, which threw down the Tsarist monarchy and replaced it with the Communist Soviet Union, leading also to the independence of many former Russian governorates, such as Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, as new European countries. Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire collapsed and broke up into separate nations, and many other nations had their borders redrawn. The Treaty of Versailles, which officially ended the First World War in 1919, was harsh towards Germany, upon whom it placed full responsibility for the war and imposed heavy sanctions. Excess deaths in Russia over the course of the First World War and the Russian Civil War, including the post-war famine, amounted to a combined total of 18 million. In 1932, under Stalin's leadership, confiscations of grain by the Soviet authorities contributed to the Second Soviet Famine, which caused millions of deaths. Surviving kulaks were persecuted and many sent to gulags to do forced labor. Stalin was also responsible for the Great Purge of 1937, in which the NKVD executed 681,692 people. Millions of people were deported and exiled to remote areas of the Soviet Union. The social revolution sweeping through Russia also affected other European nations following the Great War. In 1919, with the Weimar Republic in Germany and the First Austrian Republic, in 1922, with Mussolini's one-party fascist government in the Kingdom of Italy, and in Ataturk's Turkish Republic, adopting the Western alphabet and state secularism. Economic instability, caused in part by debts incurred in the First World War and loans to Germany, played havoc in Europe in the late 1920s and 1930s. This, and the Wall Street crash of 1929, brought about the worldwide Great Depression. Helped by the economic crisis, social instability and the threat of communism, fascist movements developed throughout Europe, placing Adolf Hitler in power of what became Nazi Germany. In 1933, Hitler became the leader of Germany and began to work towards his goal of building Greater Germany. Germany re-expanded and took back the Saarland and Rhineland in 1935 and 1936. In 1938, Austria became a part of Germany following the Anschluss. Later that year, following the Munich Agreement signed by Germany, France, the United Kingdom, and Italy, Germany annexed the Sudetenland, which was a part of Czechoslovakia inhabited by ethnic Germans, and in early 1939, the remainder of Czechoslovakia was split into the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, controlled by Germany and the Slovak Republic. At the time, the United Kingdom and France preferred a policy of appeasement. With tensions mounting between Germany and Poland over the future of Danzig, the Germans turned to the Soviets and signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which allowed the Soviets to invade the Baltic states and parts of Poland and Romania. Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, prompting France and the United Kingdom to declare war on Germany on September 3, opening the European theater of the Second World War. The Soviet invasion of Poland started on September 17 and Poland fell soon thereafter. On September 24, the Soviet Union attacked the Baltic countries and, on November 30, Finland, the latter of which was followed by the devastating Winter War for the Red Army. The British hoped to land at Narvik and send troops to aid Finland, but their primary objective in the landing was to encircle Germany and cut the Germans off from Scandinavian resources. Around the same time, Germany moved troops into Denmark. The phony war continued. In May 1940, Germany attacked France through the Low Countries. France capitulated in June 1940. By August, Germany had begun a bombing offensive against the United Kingdom but failed to convince the Britons to give up. In 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa. On December 7, 1941, Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor drew the United States into the conflict as allies of the British Empire, and other Allied forces. After the staggering Battle of Stalingrad in 1943, the German offensive in the Soviet Union turned into a continual fallback. The Battle of Kursk, which involved the largest tank battle in history, was the last major German offensive on the Eastern Front. In June 1944, British and American forces invaded France in the D-Day landings, opening a new front against Germany. Berlin finally fell in 1945, ending the Second World War in Europe. The war was the largest and most destructive in human history, with 60 million dead across the world. More than 40 million people in Europe had died as a result of the Second World War, including between 11 and 17 million people who perished during the Holocaust. The Soviet Union lost around 27 million people, mostly civilians, during the war, about half of all Second World War casualties. By the end of the Second World War, Europe had more than 40 million refugees. Several post-war expulsions in Central and Eastern Europe displaced a total of about 20 million people. The First World War, and especially the Second World War, diminished the eminence of Western Europe in world affairs. After the Second World War, the map of Europe was redrawn at the Yalta Conference and divided into two blocks, the Western countries and the Communist Eastern Bloc, separated by what was later called by Winston Churchill an Iron Curtain. The United States and Western Europe established the NATO alliance and, later, the Soviet Union and Central Europe established the Warsaw Pact. Particular hotspots after the Second World War were Berlin and Trieste, whereby the Free Territory of Trieste, founded in 1947 with the UN, was dissolved in 1954 and 1975, respectively. The Berlin blockade in 1948 and 1949 and the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961 were one of the great international crises of the Cold War. The two new superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, became locked in a 50-year-long Cold War, centered on nuclear proliferation. At the same time, decolonization, which had already started after the First World War, gradually resulted in the independence of most of the European colonies in Asia and Africa. In the 1980s, the reforms of Mikhail Gorbachev and the Solidarity movement in Poland weakened the previously rigid communist system. The opening of the Iron Curtain at the Pan-European picnic then set in motion a peaceful chain reaction, at the end of which the Eastern Bloc, the Warsaw Pact and other communist states collapsed, and the Cold War ended. Germany was reunited, after the symbolic fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and the maps of Central and Eastern Europe were redrawn once more. This made old, previously interrupted cultural and economic relationships possible, and previously isolated cities such as Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, and Trieste were now again in the center of Europe. European integration also grew after the Second World War. In 1949 the Council of Europe was founded, following a speech by Sir Winston Churchill, with the idea of unifying Europe to achieve common goals. It includes all European states except for Belarus, Russia, and Vatican City. The Treaty of Rome in 1957 established the European Economic Community between 6 Western European states with the goal of a unified economic policy and common market. In 1967 the EEC, European Coal and Steel Community, and Euratom formed the European Community, which in 1993 became the European Union. The EU established a parliament, court, and central bank, and introduced the euro as a unified currency. Between 2004 and 2013, more Central European countries began joining, expanding the EU to 28 European countries and once more making Europe a major economical and political center of power. However, the United Kingdom withdrew from the EU on January 31, 2020, as a result of a June 2016 referendum on EU membership. The Russo-Ukrainian conflict, which has been ongoing since 2014, steeply escalated when Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022, marking the largest humanitarian and refugee crisis in Europe since the Second World War and the Yugoslav Wars. Geography. Europe makes up the western fifth of the Eurasian landmass. It has a higher ratio of coast to land mass than any other continent or subcontinent. Its maritime borders consist of the Arctic Ocean to the north, the Atlantic Ocean to the west and the Mediterranean, Black, and Caspian Seas to the south. Land relief in Europe shows great variation within relatively small areas. The southern regions are more mountainous, while moving north the terrain descends from the high Alps, Pyrenees, and Carpathians, through hilly uplands, into broad, low northern plains, which are vast in the east. This extended lowland is known as the Great European Plain, and at its heart lies the North German Plain. An arc of uplands also exists along the northwestern seaboard, which begins in the western parts of the islands of Britain and Ireland, and then continues along the mountainous, fjord-cut spine of Norway. This description is simplified. Subregions such as the Iberian Peninsula and the Italian Peninsula contain their own complex features, as does mainland Central Europe itself, where the relief contains many plateaus, river valleys, and basins that complicate the general trend. Subregions like Iceland, Britain, and Ireland are special cases. The former is a land unto itself in the Northern Ocean that is counted as part of Europe, while the latter are upland areas that were once joined to the mainland until rising sea levels cut them off. Politics. The political map of Europe is substantially derived from the reorganization of Europe following the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. The prevalent form of government in Europe is parliamentary democracy, in most cases in the form of republic. In 1815, the prevalent form of government was still the monarchy. Europe's remaining 11 monarchies are constitutional. European integration is the process of political, legal, economic, and in some cases social and cultural integration of European states as it has been pursued by the powers sponsoring the Council of Europe since the end of the Second World War. The European Union has been the focus of economic integration on the continent since its foundation in 1993. More recently, the Eurasian Economic Union has been established as a counterpart comprising former Soviet states. 27 European states are members of the Politico-Economic European Union, 26 of the Border-Free Schengen Area and 20 of the Monetary Union Eurozone. Among the smaller European organizations are the Nordic Council, the Benelux, the Baltic Assembly and the Visegrad Group. Economy. As a continent, the economy of Europe is currently the largest on Earth, and it is the richest region as measured by assets under management, with over 32.7 trillion compared to North America's 27.1 trillion in 2008. In 2009, Europe remained the wealthiest region. Its 37.1 trillion in assets under management represented one-third of the world's wealth. It was one of several regions where wealth surpassed its pre-crisis year-end peak. As with other continents, Europe has a large wealth gap among its countries. The richer states tend to be in the Northwest and West in general, followed by Central Europe, while most economies of Eastern and Southeastern Europe are still reemerging from the collapse of the Soviet Union and the breakup of Yugoslavia. The model of the blue banana was designed as an economic geographic representation of the respective economic power of the regions, which was further developed into the golden banana or blue star. The trade between East and West, as well as towards Asia, which had been disrupted for a long time by the two world wars, new borders, and the Cold War, increased sharply after 1989. In addition, there is new impetus from the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative across the Suez Canal towards Africa and Asia. The European Union, a political entity composed of 27 European states, comprises the largest single economic area in the world. 19 EU countries share the euro as a common currency. 5 European countries rank in the top 10 of the world's largest national economies in GDP. This includes Germany, Russia, the United Kingdom, France, and Italy. Some European countries are much richer than others. The richest in terms of nominal GDP is Monaco with its US $185,829 per capita in 2018, and the poorest is Ukraine with its US $3,659 per capita in 2019. As a whole, Europe's GDP per capita is US $21,767 according to a 2016 International Monetary Fund assessment. Population. The population of Europe was about 742 million in 2023 according to UN estimates. This is slightly more than 1/9 of the world's population. The population density of Europe is the second highest of any continent, behind Asia. The population of Europe is currently slowly decreasing, by about 0.2% per year, because there are fewer births than deaths. This natural decrease in population is reduced by the fact that more people migrate to Europe from other continents than vice versa. Southern Europe and Western Europe are the regions with the highest average number of elderly people in the world. In 2021, the percentage of people over 65 years old was 21% in Western Europe and Southern Europe, compared to 19% in all of Europe and 10% in the world. Projections suggest that by 2050 Europe will reach 30%. This is caused by the fact that the population has been having children below replacement level since the 1970s. The United Nations predicts that Europe will decline its population between 2022 and 2050 by 7%, without changing immigration movements. According to a population projection of the UN Population Division, Europe's population may fall to between 680 and 720 million people by 2050, which would be 7% of the world population at that time. Within this context, significant disparities exist between regions in relation to fertility rates. The average number of children per female of childbearing age is 1.52, far below the replacement rate. The UN predicts a steady population decline in Central and Eastern Europe as a result of emigration and low birth rates. Language. Europe has about 225 indigenous languages, mostly falling within three Indo-European language groups: the Romance languages, derived from the Latin of the Roman Empire, the Germanic languages, whose ancestor language came from southern Scandinavia, and the Slavic languages. Slavic languages are mostly spoken in southern, central, and eastern Europe. Romance languages are spoken primarily in Western and Southern Europe, as well as in Switzerland in Central Europe and Romania and Moldova in Eastern Europe. Germanic languages are spoken in Western, Northern, and Central Europe as well as in Gibraltar and Malta in Southern Europe. Languages in adjacent areas show significant overlaps, such as in English, for example. Other Indo-European languages outside the three main groups include the Baltic group including Latvian and Lithuanian, the Celtic group including Irish, Scottish Gaelic, Manx, Welsh, Cornish and Breton, Greek, Armenian and Albanian. A distinct non-Indo-European family of Uralic languages including Estonian, Finnish, Hungarian, Erzya, Komi, Mari, Moksha and Udmurt is spoken mainly in Estonia, Finland, Hungary, and parts of Russia. Turkic languages include Azerbaijani, Kazakh, and Turkish, in addition to smaller languages in Eastern and Southeast Europe including Balkan Gagauz Turkish, Bashkir, Chavash, Crimean Tatar, Karachabakar, Kumyk, Nogai and Tatar. Kartvelian languages including Georgian, Mingrelian, and Svan are spoken primarily in Georgia. Two other language families reside in the North Caucasus including termed Northeast Caucasian, most notably including Chechen, Avar and Lesgian, and Northwest Caucasian, most notably including Adinghi. Maltese is the only Semitic language that is official within the EU, while Basque is the only European language isolate. Multilingualism and the protection of regional and minority languages are recognized political goals in Europe today. The Council of Europe Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities and the Council of Europe's European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages set up a legal framework for language rights in Europe. Religion. The largest religion in Europe is Christianity, with 76.2% of Europeans considering themselves Christians, including Catholic, Eastern Orthodox and various Protestant denominations. Among Protestants, the most popular are Lutheranism, Anglicanism, and the Reformed faith. Smaller Protestant denominations include Anabaptists as well as denominations centered in the United States such as Pentecostalism, Methodism, and Evangelicalism. Although Christianity originated in the Middle East, its center of mass shifted to Europe when it became the official religion of the Roman Empire in the late 4th century. Christianity played a prominent role in the development of the European culture and identity. Today, a bit over 25% of the world's Christians live in Europe. Islam is the second most popular religion in Europe. Over 25 million, or roughly 5% of the population, adhere to it. In Albania and Bosnia and Herzegovina, two countries in the Balkan Peninsula in southeastern Europe, Islam instead of Christianity is the majority religion. This is also the case in Turkey and in certain parts of Russia, as well as in Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan, all of which are at the border to Asia. Many countries in Europe are home to a sizable Muslim minority, and immigration to Europe has increased the number of Muslim people in Europe in recent years. The Jewish population in Europe was about 1.4 million people in 2020. There is a long history of Jewish life in Europe, beginning in antiquity. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Russian Empire had the majority of the world's Jews living within its borders. In 1897, according to Russian census of 1897, the total Jewish population of Russia was 5.1 million people, which was 4.13% of total population. Of this total, the vast majority lived within the Pale of Settlement. In 1933, there were about 9.5 million Jewish people in Europe, representing 1.7% of the population, but most were killed, and most of the rest displaced, during the Holocaust. In the 21st century, France has the largest Jewish population in Europe, followed by the United Kingdom, Germany, and Russia. Other religions practiced in Europe include Hinduism and Buddhism, which are minority religions, except in Russia's Republic of Kalmykia, where Tibetan Buddhism is the majority religion. A large and increasing number of people in Europe are irreligious, atheist and agnostic. They are estimated to make up about 18.3% of Europe's population currently. Culture. Europe as a cultural concept is substantially derived from the shared heritage of ancient Greece and the Roman Empire and its cultures. The boundaries of Europe were historically understood as those of Christendom, or more specifically Latin Christendom, as established or defended throughout the medieval and early modern history of Europe, especially against Islam, as in the Reconquista and the Ottoman Wars in Europe. This shared cultural heritage is combined by overlapping indigenous national cultures and folklores, roughly divided into Slavic, Latin, and Germanic, but with several components not part of either of these groups, notably Greek, Basque and Celtic. Historically, special examples with overlapping cultures are Strasbourg with Latin and Germanic, or Trieste with Latin, Slavic and Germanic roots. Cultural contacts and mixtures shape a large part of the regional cultures of Europe. Europe is often described as maximum cultural diversity with minimal geographical distances. Different cultural events are organized in Europe, with the aim of bringing different cultures closer together and raising awareness of their importance, such as the European Capital of Culture, the European Region of Gastronomy, the European Youth Capital and the European Capital of Sport,